crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and hear the lamentation of their women. That is
good. The 1980s not only brought us many memorable horror villains,
please God,
this is God.
But it also firmly established itself as the decade in which macho action stars were one of the most bankable commodities for film studios. Think back to the big-haired, leather-clad era, and there are a ton of actors whose movies have become synonymous with action cinema. If you wanted a testosterone-fueled trip to your local multiplex, you had movies from Tom Cruise, Sylvester Stallone, Bruce Willis, Dolph Lundgren, Jean-Claude Van Damme, Chuck Norris, Steven Seagal, Mel Gibson, Harrison Ford, and Kurt Russell, to name the most prominent stars at the time. Heck, some of these guys are still kicking ass in modern Hollywood.
Don't worry about it. I got a prescription scope.
Despite being old enough to draw a pension, like they need it, which possibly says more about the industry's current lack of creativity than it does their suitability for such roles. However, there's one legendary bodybuilder turned actor turned politician, and now Netflix's new chief action officer.
No one loves action as much as I do.
Who stands head and shoulders above his action movie colleagues. The Austrian oak himself, Arnold Schwarzenegger.
I'll be back.
Over his hugely impressive career, the former governor of California has personified several iconic roles across different genres. Think 80s action sci-fi, and your mind will undoubtedly go to The Terminator. Think action with a slice of horror, and Predator kicks all sorts of alien ass. Think 80s comedy, and you can't get past Twins, which is probably the most memorable Arnie flick from that genre. However, it's one of his earlier characters that we're focusing on in this episode of 80s Horror Memories, as we take a look back on the birth of a fearless fighter hellbent on revenge, and displaying a level of masculinity synonymous with the era, with John Milius's Conan the Barbarian. So join us as we journey to the mysterious mountain of power and the impregnable snake cult temple in one of 1982's most memorable Arnie adventures. While modern audiences are spoiled for choice for content tailored to suit most tastes, us poor, hard-done-by kids of the 80s had to make do with a limited number of channels, let alone movies or TV shows we could consume either theatrically or via home video. Television was largely dominated by ABC, CBS, and NBC, with shows like Dallas, Cheers, Miami Vice, Dynasty, and Knots Landing dominating the viewing figures. On the horizon, however, was the introduction of cable TV, and before long, the programming led to the emergence of prominent action heroes that not only existed on the small screen, but also transferred to the silver screen. With the 80s being synonymous with many of these weird, wonderful, and everlasting IPs, it's fun to revisit an interesting tale in the birth of Conan the Barbarian, and another muscle-bound character from that decade. The eponymous hero from Conan has developed his own mythical status, thanks to a muscle-bound physique and legendary escapades. However, the film itself has also grown its own mythical status, and one interesting story is that of toy company Mattel, who had created a range of Conan the Barbarian action figures to market alongside the movie. However, after seeing the blood-soaked final product, Mattel had a severe case of the wobbles and opted out of the deal, leaving themselves with several hundred figures, all bearing a passing resemblance of Arnie as the Sumerian Slayer. Desperate to recoup the investment that Mattel had made in the toys, they instead, or so the story goes, revamped the dolls and came up with another legendary 80s character. He-Man. This led to CPI, that's Conan Properties International, suing the toy manufacturer. However, Mattel went on to win the case for several reasons, but partly because CPI's head of licensing knew about Mattel's range of He-Man figures before signing the agreement with them.
He-Man, the most powerful man in the universe.
In my household in the 80s, my family always made sure us kids had an eclectic and varied exposure to all kinds of TV shows and movies. He-Man and the Masters of the Universe often adorned the TV, and yes, I had one of those Arnie reimagined action figures to play with. However, it was mainly the strong action and fantasy heroes that left a lasting impression. Our local cinema was an awesome 2-screen venue that was so popular with the locals that it would have queues stretching around the block for all of the biggest blockbusters on their opening day.
What are you? I'm Batman.
One of these such movies was Arnold Schwarzenegger's first proper big screen role. Not discounting Hercules in New York, of course. As the title character in Conan the Barbarian, and although his star wasn't quite aligned with having a queue around the block, the movie left a lasting impression on this young movie fan. And there was one main reason for that: Arnold Schwarzenegger. Sure, he may be monosyllabic, but his eyes do the talking, as well as his sword, of course. And despite the marketing for the movie leading you to believe to the contrary, this isn't simply a hack and slash affair from beginning to end. Instead, what we get is a tale of a hero whose travels see him go on a journey to avenge the mental and physical torment he went through 20 years earlier, with, yes, plenty of bloodshed along the way. On his quest, he meets several companions, including love interest Valeria, a relationship that works all the better for the lack of dialogue, with their stolen glances and scenes together proving to be ultimately engaging.
Yeah, Conan the Barbarian, saw the drive-in, I think with Tourist Trap. It was a double bill, weird double bill, but it was a double bill nonetheless. I loved Conan the Barbarian. I loved I don't think Lord of the Rings exists without Conan the Barbarian. Like the movie. You know, I think the Conan the Barbarian paves the way for that fantasy on that scale, because it shows you a big epic time, you know, a story that travels through, not time traveling, but takes place over a long period of time. And it is such an epic journey, a sword and sorcery journey. You know, it probably owes a lot more to Lawrence of Arabia and even you know, the Last Valley and all the, you know, the James Clavell sort of world that Milius brought into Conan, and you know, with Oliver Stone's script and everything, and they all felt very much, you know, like it's a great, you can see it's a direct descendant to Apocalypse Now, especially the ending. And it's just like, hey, wait a minute, isn't that what happens when Willard comes out with Kurtz's head, and Arnold comes out with James Earl Jones's head? I think I've seen that before.
With the movie having recently enjoyed its 40th anniversary, what better time to reflect upon its lasting legacy than in our continuing series on 80s horror? And while it may not be an outright horror film, it does feature enough elements of the genre to move it out of just fantasy and action. Also, recent entries in the fantasy genre have taken direct influence from Conan, with the excellent Robert Eggers Viking epic, and a favorite amongst the JoBlo staff, The Northman, being a great example. In the film, Alexander Skarsgård's Amleth goes on a rampage of revenge through Dark Ages Iceland for retribution against the man who killed his father. Sound familiar? Anybody who's seen Conan the Barbarian knows that the narrative centers on Arnie's titular character who, as a young boy, witnesses the murder of his parents and tried by a savage warlord and sorcerer, Thulsa Doom. As he grows older, Conan becomes a fearsome and invincible fighter and plots revenge against Thulsa Doom. From this point onwards, we follow Conan as he becomes a gladiator, a thief, and ultimately finds camaraderie with Jerry Lopez's archer Sabutai, and also love in the form of dancer Santal Bergman's warrior woman Valeria. This may all sound a tad rote, however, the fantasy genre wasn't poured over with love by audiences, and Conan the Barbarian was said to have rehabilitated the genre somewhat. The key to this, it seemed, was to follow Richard Donner's approach with his 1978 Superman, which is to keep the tongue firmly away from the cheek and approach the story with earnest. Before he directed Conan, John Milius had already flexed his action muscles with movies such as 1973's Dillinger, but it was also events from his personal life that drove his desire to embrace action cinema. He had attempted to sign up for the Marine Corps in the late 1960s in order to volunteer for the Vietnam War, but was rejected due to a chronic and sometimes disabling case of mild asthma. This absolutely devastated Milius, later saying about the rejection that, "I'd given anything to be a Marine. As a surfer, I'd spent a lot of time hanging out with the Marines off Pendleton, and I'd had every intention of joining up. I was devastated. I felt like I'd been rejected as a human being." He also describes an urge to prove himself in battle, and that all young men, since the days of cavemen, long to do, whether or not it makes sense, or is in fact a sane thing to do. He also considered becoming an artist before a trip to Hawaii on vacation in 1962 led him to fall in love with cinema during a trip to a local picture house showing a week of Akira Kurosawa films. Subsequently, Milius poured all of these underlying notions of masculinity and the importance of martial prowess into making Conan the Barbarian. He didn't just see the movie as another run-of-the-mill Saturday matinee B-movie, but rather a more serious meditation on life, death, and the power of mythical storytelling. It was serious stuff for the director, but not so serious to not have Arnie punching out a camel. Before he became a worldwide action star, Arnold Schwarzenegger was most prominently known in the world of bodybuilding alone. And it wasn't until the 1977 documentary Pumping Iron that he started to draw the attention of Hollywood. Conan producers Edward R. Pressman and Edward Summer saw the potential of Arnie in the film and believed his amazing physique and chiseled features would be perfect for Robert E. Howard's Cimmerian Slayer and part-time camel boxer. However, there was one drawback to the seemingly perfect action star that they had discovered: his less than poor English skills.
You took my father's sword! Ha!
Initially, the script relied on Conan having substantial scenes with dialogue. And although director Milius coached Arnie through these scenes, he was forced to ruthlessly cut his lines down to the bare minimum. Fortunately, however, this proved to be a masterstroke, as although the Austrian oak stumbles through a few emotional scenes slightly, his physical performance more than makes up for a lack of dialogue. The movie cemented Arnie as an action hero, and this breakout role led to arguably his most iconic role ever in James Cameron's 1984 classic, The Terminator, plus, everything else since. The 1980s were a key decade for the fantasy genre, especially action fantasy, with films such as Highlander, Legend, Krull, Deathstalker, The Beastmaster, Dune, and Red Sonja, just several films that are looked back upon with fond memories by fans of the genre. While Conan the Barbarian didn't necessarily begin the decade's trend of action and horror fantasy alone, it's certainly a key movie in the genre overall. You can argue that George Lucas's Star Wars began the push for more pulp content with the release of Episode 4, A New Hope in 1977, with filmmakers keen to push the boundaries of fantastical storytelling as far as the imagination of audiences would let them. Subsequently, Conan's critical reception at the time, and also its reputation now, is arguably pretty decent, and just proved that there was an appetite for more serious fantasy content in the 1980s. Upon rewatching the movie for this retrospective, it's a film that, although not perfect, brushes off its flaws with bombastic set pieces. The pacing of the film is a little off, and some of the sexual politics are a tad questionable. However, the fantasy genre should never play it safe when it comes to scope. And although there are gripes to be had with the ambition of the movie, this is all part of its charm. The scene towards the end where the murdered Valeria's spirit returns to save his life may be looked upon as cheesy.
Do you want to live forever?
But it works just fine in context with what we just watched for the last couple of hours. Her return and subsequent actions led to Conan eventually defeating the nefarious Doom, but not before he's forced to question just what his journey has become. He has sacrificed everything to get to the point of killing his enemy, but if he does so, will there be anything left for him afterwards? This all leads back to what makes the film so memorable. Its many moments of unparalleled action and all of the elements that make up the overall appeal. A freshly discovered megastar with a physique perfect for the role, bloody emotional battle scenes, an awesome Valkyrie, a classic villain, an excellent score, and most important of all, a hero's legendary journey. If I'm ever in the position where I need to convince someone to watch Conan for the first time, such as a sibling whose fantasy film collection doesn't go beyond a soiree into Middle-earth, or a journey to that ever-expanding galaxy far, far away, then I remind them of the aforementioned qualities of Milius's Conan. Also, the movie goes way beyond the macho elements it quite clearly has on the surface. For all of Arnie's brawn in the film, which is impressively on display at all times, the film has a depth that may surprise newcomers to the world of the Cimmerian Slayer in the form of the Riddle of Steel.
The riddle of steel.
Yes. You know what it is, don't you, boy?
This brings Conan's culture to life and is the basis for the motivation that lies deep within him. However, if you ask anybody what the riddle actually is, you may get some differing opinions.
Just the James Earl Jones character, the villain is, so many of these movies, they live and die by how good their villain is. And James Earl Jones is an amazing villain because, when he talks about the power of steel versus the power of faith and somebody, how he can kill somebody by just waving his hand, how he can lure somebody to do something that's against their interests and their well-being because of his charisma. That's the world we live in. Right now, that is unbelievably real, and Conan's a great. It just shows us that facet has been around forever as an idea of these charismatic madmen who lead people to their doom and destruction, and you just need somebody like Conan to take care of them.
So, our time looking back on the masculinity of 80s fantasy, and in particular Conan the Barbarian, is almost at an end. As just a young lad obsessed with guitars, heavy metal, and movies, the 80s were a decade that helped to shape my life of these wonderful pursuits. We were very fortunate to have such an amazing array of male and female action stars. Yeah, we haven't forgotten about you, Cynthia Rothrock or Linda Hamilton and Carter, but that's for another video and another time. Conan, at the time for this young rocker, was throwaway fun, something I could watch on VHS or when the networks picked it up and not really think about it too much, other than be dazzled by the over-the-top action. However, looking back on the film as an adult, a parent, and yes, still a guitar-wielding badass metalhead, well, in my head at least, the movie has more depth and hidden layers to it. Arnie would revisit the role in the 1984 sequel, Conan the Destroyer, with another awesome female action star, Grace Jones. And there has long been talk about the Austrian Oak revisiting the role as King Conan, or Conan the King, depending on which source you're reading or watching. There are also rumors about a Netflix show, which might come to fruition and erase memories of the largely disappointing Jason Momoa 2011 remake. However, for now, we'll have to make do with the 1980s incarnation of the Sumerian Slayer, punching camels and kicking ass all the way to the Mountain of Power.
On the next episode, we take a chilly detour down to Outpost 31. So whip out that petri dish and lock away your pet husky as we take a look at John Carpenter's The Thing. Until next time, gorehounds.
Hi friends, your humble narrator Tyler Nichols here, and I hope that you enjoyed that episode of 80s Horror Memories. If you missed our previous episode, click over here. If you want to see more from our series, click up here. And if you're not subscribed yet, what are you doing? Subscribe right here. And most importantly, stay spooky, folks.